Daniel chapter 6, one of the most well-known scriptures in the Bible, and certainly a favorite of many. And I want us to look at all 28 verses because it's one story. And I want us to think about thriving in the lion's den. Not surviving, but thriving in the lion's den. Beginning in verse 1, chapter 6 of Daniel. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom. And they were in charge of the whole kingdom, but over them he set 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one. And of these satraps might be accountable to them, so that the kingdom might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and the satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to his government affairs. But they could find no grounds for accusal or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and not negligent nor corruptible in all that they found about him. Then these same men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find against him in regard to the law of his God." Then these commissioners and the satraps became by agreement to the king, and they spoke to him as follows: "King Darius, live forever. All of the commissioners of the kingdom and the prefects and the satraps of the high officials and the governors all came together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or any man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may never be revoked." Therefore King Darius signed the document, and it is the injunction. Now when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he entered into his house. Now in his roof chamber there was windows open toward Jerusalem. And Daniel continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks to God, as he had always been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and they spoke to the king about the king's injunction. "Did you not sign this injunction that any man who makes a petition of God or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is cast into the lion's den?" The king replied, "The statement is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked." Then they answered to him, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to your injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petitions 3 times a day to his God." Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed. He set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until the sunset hour, he was exerting himself to find a way of rescuing Daniel. But these men came to him by agreement to the king, and they said to him, "King, recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or statutes which have been signed by the king and has been established may be changed." Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. But the king spoke to Daniel. He said, "Your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you." And a stone was brought in and laid over the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing could be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace that night. There was no fasting. There was no entertainment brought before him. And he slept, but his sleep fled from him, or his sleep fled from him. Verse 19, "Then the king arose at dawn, at the very break of day, and he went into haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke this to Daniel: 'Daniel, servant of the most living God, has your God whom you constantly serve, has he been able to deliver you from the lions?' Then Daniel spoke to the king, 'O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I have been found innocent before God and towards you, O king. I have committed no crime.' Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den with no injury found upon him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders and brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel and cast them and their children and their wives into the lion's den. And they did not even reach the bottom of the den before they were overpowered by the lions, and all of their bones were crushed. Then Darius the king wrote to all the people, all the nations, and men of every language that were living in the land, "You may have peace, and may peace abound you. I make this decree, that the kingdom of God you shall fear is the kingdom of Daniel. Daniel's God, he is the God, a living God. He endures forever. His kingdom is a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Of his dominion there will not be an end." And then in verse 27, "He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who can be delivered like this Daniel except from his God? For his God has delivered him from the power of the lions." So this same Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Most Christians today live in comfortable homes with all the amenities that prosperity provides us. We find it difficult to grasp the thousands and thousands of Christians who are being persecuted every year for no other reason than their faith. Most of you that know me know I've traveled quite extensively. I've worked in 75 different countries in the last 30 years with missionaries, and I don't know why God has put so many people in my path that are being persecuted and have been persecuted. I've told you about Jamal that's in Iraq. He's been in prison since 2010, and his only crime is that he was a former Muslim. He put his faith and trust in Christ, and he refuses to worship anybody but Jesus. I told you a little bit last week about Hassan, the first person I ever met that really changed my life. I was in the Philippines in 1998 in December, and got to know Hassan. He's Malay. He's from Malaysia. He was a former Muslim, and he was telling me his story of when he was a young boy, how his mom and dad had become Christians, and how when he was about 14 years old, he's sitting out on the portico one morning eating mangoes for breakfast, and the police break in, and they beat his father, and they drag him off to jail, and they beat his mother. His mother's in bed, in her bedclothes, and they beat her with some kind of wood about the size of a baseball bat, and they beat her to death. Of course, that's illegal, but there again, if it's the police in Kuala Lumpur that's doing it, they didn't get prosecuted. His father finally gets out of jail. Of course, Hassan had to go live with his grandmother and grandfather for a while to be re-educated in Islam. When his father finally got out of jail, his father, by the way, was a very, very wealthy businessman, had a lot of contacts in the government in Kuala Lumpur. And so when his father gets out of prison, he realized, I've got to help my son escape or he's going to face the same thing that I face. So they went down to Port Dixon. They had a trawler coming to pick him up. And so as they're swimming out to meet this trawler, a shot rings out and his father gets shot in the back. And Hassan, with tears running down his face, is telling me this story. And he says, the last words I heard my father say was, "Swim, son, swim." He said, so I obeyed my dad. And as a 16-year-old kid, he's swimming out to this trawler, and he's taken to a different country in Europe, which I won't, since we're recording this, I won't announce. But he found out later when he was 18 years old, his father had left him some money. And so one of the things that he had set his mind to doing was he was trying to get people out of persecution. And so whether it was through working through the government or actually getting them out, he was physically getting them out. And I've met him several times since then. We've been in Spain together. I remember I was in, what I would always do is anytime I'm traveling in the world, I would send him an email to one of 5 email addresses that he continued to switch between. And he would sometimes contact me and say, hey, I'm going to be close there. And so we would arrange to meet. And so once I was in Madrid, and I remember that I had told him I was going to be there. My meetings were all over, and I didn't hear from him. And so I was getting ready to go to bed, and the lady from the front desk calls up, and it's about 10 o'clock at night, and she says, there's a man here that will not give me his name, but he says that he wants to see you, and he says you're expecting him. Well, I wasn't sure who it would be. I thought it might be somebody from Dawn Ministries or Campus Crusade or YWAM or someone. But I went ahead and came back downstairs, and it was him, and we went up to Starbucks. And for the next 2 hours until they closed, we had just a glorious time rejoicing together about all that God was doing in his life. But then in 2006, I had sent him some emails because I wanted to catch up with him. I hadn't heard from him in over a year. I wanted to catch up with him. I didn't hear anything for a while. And about 6 weeks later, I got this phone call on my cell phone, and it's him. He says, is this a secure line? And I said, yes, it's my cell number. And he said, well, I'm in Gibraltar. And he began to tell me some stories about what happened to him just the few days earlier, in fact, 2 days earlier. And he began to tell me how one of his best friends that he had met was a Saudi national and had been called back home to take care of some family issues. And when he was brought back into the country, he was arrested. they'd taken him outside of Riyadh, the capital, and they were going to behead him because he was a Muslim who had now become a Christian. That's why he was arrested. And so he had 3 men that were ex-military that had helped him do some other things, and they'd always been able to get people out without any kind of firing, any arms. They didn't carry any weapons whatsoever. They're just going to try to rescue the people. And so these 3 men were going to help him, and the man had a 4-year-old daughter and his wife that were living in Riyadh, and 2 of the men were supposed to get them, and Hussein and his other friends supposed to rescue these guys that are out in the desert. And so he goes through, and he's crawling on the sand there, and he said, I could see the gate. And the guards had already turned in. He said, all we had to do is climb over the wall, break into the jail, and get him out. It was going to be a simple thing. He had done it before. He said, but all of a sudden he felt the cold steel behind his neck, and he heard the click of a Russian rifle. He said, I knew something had went wrong. And so they took him in jail, and they put him side by side with his best friend. He said, Ed, you remember when the Bible talks about Paul and Silas singing in jail? He said, I know what it's like. He said, I do. He said, I knew we were going to die the next morning. He said, there was no room for fear or doubt. He said, I know what they're experiencing. He said, I can't tell you the peace that I had. He said, we were singing and quoting scripture all night long. He said, the next morning as he went before the magistrate, he said his friend was told, you've been found guilty. You will die today. And he led him over to the chopping block. He said, you are not Saudi. He said, therefore, you're not a Saudi citizen, so therefore you will go back to Riyadh, you will stand trial, and you probably will have this same faith. But a judge has to pronounce that on you. And he said, I looked over, and I was going to go over as close as I could to my friend. He said, then I knew something was terribly wrong because his wife and his 4-year-old daughter was there. He said, I grabbed her head, and I held it to my chest so she couldn't see what was about to happen to her dad. And he describes how they took his arms, they pulled it tight, and they leaned his head over, and they turned his head so he could get a clean cut. He said, and as they raised the sword to cut his head off, he said, I saw my friends say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, as his head left his body. You may say, preacher, that sure is a gruesome story. It is a gruesome story. But that's the world we live in today. That is happening every single day somewhere in this world, because Islam is saying, we want to win this world for Allah, and they're radical about it. Is every Muslim a radical? No, they're not. I've got Muslim friends who are still Muslims, and they're not radical. But there is that element. And what I want you to realize is when we read about Daniel, this is nothing but sheer persecution. These guys were jealous of Daniel because Daniel could do something because of the Spirit of God that was in him that nobody else would do. And they got jealous of Daniel, and so they began to persecute him. But we live in a world where we're kind of blinded from that persecution. We don't see it. I don't know why God has allowed me to see so many people and become friends with so many people that are in prison or have been persecuted who have, at the risk of their life, continued to be faithful. But I know this. It makes me want to be like that. It makes me want to be the kind of man that God could put in that situation. I hope he never does, but should he, I hope I would be like Daniel. I hope I would be like Hussein and be faithful. Persecution began in Genesis when Cain murdered Abel. Why did he do that? Because Abel had a great relationship with God, because Abel worshiped God the way God wanted to be worshiped, and Cain refused to do it. And by the way, his persecution is going to continue until God comes back and ends it forever. Of all the stories in Daniel, none are more famous than Daniel chapter 6. It reminds us of chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It provokes our imaginations. It grabs our hearts. When we think about a 90-year-old man being cast into a ravenous group of lions who are hungry, and knowing that even Darius had a little bit of faith, he said, surely your God will deliver you from this. But everybody else thought, this is the end of him. Finally, we've gotten rid of him. He's in there with those lions who are hungry. He's a goner. That's what they thought. Because he continued to pray to his God. Now, think about this for just a moment. Daniel could have compromised. He could have said, for 30 days, I'm not going to pray. For 30 days, that's all he had to do. Just don't pray to your God for 30 days. You didn't have to pray to Darius. Just don't pray to any other God if you do pray. But God would have never got the honor and the glory out of this had he compromised. You realize this was 2,500 years ago, and we're still talking about it today. And if the world stands another 2,500 years, they'll still be talking about it then. God has gotten honor and glory from him doing. He just continued doing what he was doing. So no matter how serious the persecution, God will always honor his servant, and he always glorifies himself. And by the way, when it comes to Jesus and Caesar, Jesus will always win when it comes to loyalty, obedience, and worship. Those who worship Caesar will fall by the wayside, but those who worship Jesus will be obedient. We will be faithful, and we will be loyal. I think there's a lesson also to be learned about Daniel's age. He was approximately 90 years old. Now, don't get upset with me. My hair's white too. But I see a lot of white hair in here. Why is it we think, is it really that rare that we think that senior adults don't have anything to contribute? Listen, senior adults have a lot to contribute. Just to give you some examples, Michelangelo, the immortal Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, he did it when he was 88 years old. John Wesley preached 3 and 4 times a day, every day, when he was 88. Thomas Edison was still inventing at 90. J.C. Penney was still running his company at 95 years old. And Ronald Reagan was still president at 77. I've got a friend who just passed away 2 years ago, Gary Harcock. Y'all may have heard me mention him and Miss Evelyn. From time they were 60 until she was 95 and he was 97, and the Lord took them home. They worked in Southeast Asia, and so they were living in Chiang Mai, and you'd always know them when you'd go down the street because they made their own clothes. And his top matched her top and pants always. So you see them, and it was always the tie material. And so I knew when Gary and Evelyn was out because I could see them, and they were taking their books they had written, and they had won hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Buddhist monks to Jesus Christ. Heaven will be full of former Buddhists because of the work that Gary and Evelyn did. But back when Brother Gary was about 85 and I was at Southeastern, one of my students said, "Brother Gary, you're 85 years old?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "When are you going to retire?" And he said, "When the devil retires, I'll retire." And he ain't quit yet. Well, let's fast forward till he was 97. When Miss Evelyn was 95, she got Alzheimer's really bad, and he was so loved and respected that Rom 1 Hospital, which I've been a patient there before, Rom 1 Hospital let him and her live there in a room, and he took care of her needs he could take care of, and then they took care of the rest of them. $500 a month. You know any other hospital will do that? Not in America. It's not going to happen. They did it because they loved him. Well, when she passed away, he got real sick, and he couldn't take care of himself, so they let him continue to live there in that hospital room. And I visited him the summer before he died in January. In fact, I missed him by 4 days. If I'd arrived 4 days early, I'd have got to see Brother Gary before God took him home. But here he was, 97 years old, living in a hospital room, and he had dozens and dozens and dozens of pastors all over the world. And he would get up and he would email them, and he would encourage them and exhort them, stand firm, keep fighting the fight, keep the faith. I mean, he was doing everything he could at 97 years old. And there on his little file cabinet was that saying, "I'll give up I'll quit when the devil quits," and he ain't quit yet. Well, I'm sad to say the devil still hadn't quit, but Brother Gary didn't either. God took him home. He's with his reward today. Why am I sharing this with you? Listen to me. I don't care how old you are. We will never, ever get too old to stop serving God. God's got something for us to do. God's got a way for us to bring honor and glory to his name. So whether you're 12 or 120, if you make it to 120, God will still use you if we'll let him. 90 years old here, and Daniel is lifting God up and trusting God and serving God, and that ought to be an example for us. 5 things real quick I want us to look at. First is in verse 1 through 9, I want us to look at the plotting against God's prophet. Now, do realize when we start doing things for God, the outside world, the lost world, they don't like it. The devil does everything he can to slow us down and to stop us. And so here we have right at the beginning, they're plotting against Daniel. Daniel had been promoted by Nebuchadnezzar, he'd been promoted by Belshazzar, and now he's promoted by Darius. And so notice what it says here. It says he distinguished himself above all others. Why did he distinguish himself above all others? Well, we see in chapter 3, 4, and 5 the same thing. Daniel gets promoted. Notice this. It says, because he had an excellent or an extraordinary spirit in him. If we are ever going to be used by God the way Daniel was used by God, we can't have a critical spirit. We can't have a spirit of bitterness. We're going to have an extraordinary spirit. And the only way to do that is to walk with God. So I think the lesson we need to learn is if we ever want to be used like this, it's not going to be because of our giftedness or our intelligence or anything else. It will be because you and I walk with God. And because we walk with God, we will have an exceptional walk with God. We'll have an exceptional spirit. Look at verse 4 and 5. Whenever God's people prosper, there will be those that plot to destroy them. And beginning in verse 4, we can see it's that green-eyed monster called jealousy. You mean you're going to put this Hebrew, this exile from Jerusalem, you're going to put him over all your kingdom? I don't think so. I'm going to stop that. I mean, why not? I'm a Babylonian, and you're going to put him over me? They got jealous. Nobody wanted to take orders from him. They were fearful of him. The princes and prime ministers were envious of him, and so they set out to investigate. I love this fact. First off, they're going to investigate him professionally. let's just see how he's doing. Oh, he's doing really well. I mean, government affairs, he's doing them the way they ought to be done. You know what? We'll attack him personally, but his character personally is perfect. Wait a minute. If we devise this plan, we know Daniel. Now think about this. For them to devise a plan for Darius, based on what Daniel was doing, they knew he was a man of God. They knew he prayed 3 times a day. They knew he was not going to stop praying. The only way they could do it was actually not appeal to Daniel's sin, because Daniel, at this particular point, in this particular case, didn't have sin in his life. He's not sinless, but according to this accusation, he was. They had to go and appeal to Darius' greed. Think about it. Oh, king, we're going to make you God for a month. Anybody that bows is going to bow to you. They can't pray to the God of Israel. They can't pray for their family. They can't pray for the sick. They can't pray for themselves. Everybody will be praying to you. One thing we need to learn about pride. Sin blinds us. Pride blinds us. Darius was blinded. He didn't see it coming. Darius never realized when he's setting all this up, you're being set up. You're being set up for a fall because you're going to have to take down Daniel. And we know you want to promote him. That's what sin does to us. I love this testimony. Daniel was found to be a man that was righteous and godly. Wouldn't it be great if someone, and they want to trip you up or trip me up, the only thing they could find wrong with us was our relationship with God. That's all they found wrong with Daniel, was his relationship with God. Look at verses 6 through 9. No fault was found in him, so they appealed to Darius. Let's make you God for a month. In verses 8 and 9, Darius was so enthralled with being God for a month, he never, ever let it occur to him, which shows us that even great kings are blinded by pride. The second thing I want us to notice is praying to God by his prophet. Really, verse 10 is the whole focal point, if you will, or central point of this passage, because it establishes the inner spiritual strength and resolve of Daniel to do what is right. It reminds me of Ezekiel 14, 13 and 14, where it says, Son of man, if the country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, I will stretch out my hand against it. I will destroy its supply of bread, and I will send famine against it. I will cut it off both from man and beast. Even though these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst by their own righteousness, they could only deliver themselves, said the Lord. Now notice this, Daniel stands in the company of 2 of the strongest and most courageous saints of all time. Verse 10 shows the degree to which Daniel was willing to serve God. Notice what it says. He went upstairs as he normally did, as was his tradition. He went upstairs. By the way, he could have continued. He could have went downstairs and prayed. But everybody that knew Daniel knew he's got a window open to Jerusalem so he can look toward Jerusalem and pray. And that's where he always prayed. So for him to change anything, they would say, yep, you're giving in to the king. You're compromising. Daniel was not going to compromise, knowing that it may cost him something. In fact, it may cost him his very life. Daniel says, I'm going up to where I always pray, and I'm going to do what I need to do. I'm going to pray, but also notice that not only am I going to pray, I'm going to praise God. Daniel was true, even though he knew it would cost him. Someday it may cost us. There's a message we don't want to hear. We don't want to hear that persecution may someday come here like it is in other countries. But it may. You and I may live to see real, genuine, hardcore persecution in this country against you and against me. The question is, will you and I be able to stand? I think we can pull some things out of Scripture here that will help us, no matter what this world does, help us to be able to stand faithful like Daniel. So even though he knew it would cost him. By the way, I wanted to say this. Daniel's relationship with God was not precipitated by crisis. It was precipitated by his day-to-day, constant, sincere, consistent walk. He wasn't up one day and down the next. He walked with God day in and day out and day in and day out to where everybody in the community knew he was. They knew he was a God follower. They knew he was consistent in his prayer. They knew he was consistent in his walk, which tells me something. When a crisis comes up, if I turn to God during that crisis and I have not been walking with him throughout the rest of the year, there's a problem. We should not have a relationship with God based on crisis. God carries us through those crises when we have been walking with him in the times of non-crisis. And so we know that Daniel lived his life in a state of walking with God consistently, whether it was crisis or not. The third thing I want us to look at in verse 11 through 18 is the actual persecution of God's prophet. In verses 11 through 13, we see conspiracy of the princes and the prime ministers. They catch Daniel praying. They rush to Darius and tell him, but notice this, they remind him of the law. They were not going to let Darius get out of this. In fact, remember, they talked him into sign this decree, because if you sign it, it becomes a law. It can't be changed. In verses 14 through 17, we see the consternation, the dread that Darius experienced. Darius was trapped by the law that he set out. He couldn't overturn it. Verse 14, Darius was trying to figure out, how do I save Daniel from this fiasco? Notice what it says. He was deeply distressed, and he set his mind on delivering Daniel. He did everything in his power he could possibly do, but he could not go against the law of the Medes and the Persians. I wonder sometimes if the law was wrote for us, that we could no longer gather together. We could no longer worship the true and living God. I wonder if there'd be an outcry from the Christian community. Would we rise up to the occasion and say, we're not going to allow you to do that? It's wrong. Verse 16 to 17, Daniel's thrown into the lion's den. But notice this, Daniel, your God will deliver you. He's not a believer himself in God, but he's a believer that he knows Daniel can stay in touch with God, and he believes that Daniel's God will deliver him. Verse 18, he had a sleepless night. There was no entertainment. Sleep left him. There was no food. He fasted. He was concerned about Daniel. The fourth thing is preservation of God's prophets, verse 19 through 25. In 19 and 20, Darius set up he got up at the crack of dawn. Early in the morning. He hadn't been sleeping anyway. So just as soon, the moment he could get to the lion's den, he was there. Daniel, are you all right? Did your God deliver you? And I love verse 21 and 22, because 21 and 22 is evidence of divine deliverance. Notice what he says here. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. Now, it seems to me that it's the same angel that was in chapter 3 with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was the same angel that wrestled with Joseph in chapter 32 of Genesis. That's why I said this is him thriving. I want you to get this picture. Not only is Daniel in the lion's den, he's in the lion den with the pre-incarnate Son of God, the angel of the Lord. Now, wouldn't you love to have heard that conversation? The second person, the Trinity, the angel of the Lord that becomes Jesus Christ as we know him in the New Testament, he's there all night with Daniel. I can just picture Daniel with his head up against one of them big old fat lion's bellies. Have you ever seen a lion up close? I have. They're fuzzy. They're great pillow. And the Lord himself talking to him. I'd love to hear that conversation. Oh, Daniel wasn't surviving. Daniel was thriving. Daniel can tell us things that none of us will ever know this side of eternity. What is it like for God to manifest himself in the person of the angel of the Lord and keep those lions at bay all night long? Of course, what happens to the others the next morning, we know they were hungry. But the Bible says that before they ever even hit the bottom, their bones were crushed. So I would say he was thriving. Daniel explains to Darius that the reason for his deliverance, I love this, notice this. He says, I am innocent in God's eyes, and you, O king, I have not wronged either. Daniel's not claiming to be sinless. He's just claiming that in this case, I have not sinned against you. The accusations against me are untrue. In verse 23 and 24, we see two deliveries. Daniel is delivered from the lion's den, but these scoundrels are delivered to the lion's den. They're crushed, all their bones. I want us to look at verse 25 through 28 and see the fifth thing is the proclamation. And this is really what I think it's all about. I want us to look at verse 25 through 28 because God is honored in all of this. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples of all nations and men of every language who were living in the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that all the dominion of my kingdom and all the men who fear and tremble should fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God. He is enduring forever, and of his kingdom is one which shall never be destroyed, and his kingdom is one that's forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel enjoyed success for the reign of Darius under the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I think one of the things that I really want to take home from this is this. I need to be faithful in praying. I need to be faithful in living my life day to day in times of crisis, in times of non-crisis. By our lives, we bring honor to God or we bring dishonor to God. For example, without giving any names, just over the last 40 years, think of the preachers who have fallen into immorality. That brings dishonor to God's name because we're supposed to be different. I'm not just talking about preachers, I'm talking about Christians. If you're a true believer in Jesus Christ, we're supposed to live different than the world. And so when we don't live different than the world, we dishonor God. Daniel had made his commitment. He's going to honor God, and we see it from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 12. Daniel honors God. Think about it. And because of Daniel's lifestyle, Nebuchadnezzar, what did he do? I make this decree that no one speaks anything against the God of Daniel. And then Belshazzar, the same thing. And now here we have Darius. You have these kings who are, they are not believers, although we do know Nebuchadnezzar became a believer. But when they made their decrees, they're saying, the God of Daniel, we exalt him. The God of Daniel, you shall not say anything about him. The God of Daniel, you shall worship him. God is being honored in those things, and God needs to be honored in your life and in my life. One of the ways I think that we can honor him is through prayer. And I'm amazed at how a lot of people that are Christians, that you'll pray in home behind closed doors or you'll pray in church, but you won't pray at lunch. Let me give you an example. Back in 1991, there was a restaurant in North Georgia. It was close to the Toccoa Falls College, and they were famous for their pecan waffles. And so the Atlanta Christian College, they had their girls softball or girls soccer team, and they were going up to play Toccoa Falls. And so they got to this restaurant early in the morning. They all ordered the pecan waffles because, I mean, that's what they're known for. They're really, really good. And so all of them come, and the waffles are all there, and they all bow their heads, and they're getting ready to ask God's blessing on it. And the waitress that was there, she wasn't a believer, and she hadn't seen people praying over it before, and she's wondering what's going on. And she leans down to one of the girls. She says, "If you're looking for the pecans, they're on the bottom." That's a true story. That ain't a preacher story. That happened. Let me share one more with you. When Debbie and I lived in Orange Park, Florida, we went to Orange Park First Baptist Church, and my Sunday school teacher, he was a great guy, amazing guy. He owned one of the divisions of Toledo Scale, and so he invited me to lunch one day up off North Blanding Boulevard on the north side of Jacksonville. And so I went to lunch, and I'm just being me, I'm who I am. And so our food comes, and I asked my teacher, I said, "Would you like to ask God's blessing on it?" Well, there was somebody that was with us that was his vice president and had been his vice president for 5 or 6 years. I didn't know that the guy was as lost as a goose, but still, it doesn't matter. You pray, ask God's blessing. But to look on his face for a moment, it was this, look at me, look at him, look at me, look at him. And he goes, "Okay," and he prays. And then I realized that he wasn't used to praying in public. And I kind of felt bad that I asked him to. But he came to me 2 weeks later after Sunday school and said, "I got to tell you something." He said, "The guy that was with me is my vice president. He's been doing it for 5 years." He says, "I didn't want to offend him." He says, "So I've never prayed with him." He said, "But thank you for challenging me to do it." He said, "Because we always have at least lunch at least 2 days a week." He said, "And every time now I pray," and he said, "Guess what? He's reading the Bible." So listen, I'm going to pray wherever I'm at. If God, I don't care whether it's a Chinese restaurant, Mexican restaurant, whatever it is. I'm going to pray because I want God's blessing on that meal because it does honor God, because I am committed my heart and my life to him, and I'm thankful for what God gives me to eat. So that's just food for thought. But again, if Daniel had compromised, God would not have got the glory out of this. Now, what can we take from this? Well, 4 things real quick, and then we're done. One, we need to realize that persecution of Christians is accelerating in this world, and one day you and I may face physical, financial, and emotional persecution against us for no other reason than you put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And the question is, are you ready for that? The thing I take from this passage is this: we don't need to wait until there's a time of crisis. We need to be on our knees and walking with God 7 days a week when things are great, so that when things are not great, through those times of crisis, we can continue to walk with God. But I will promise you, we will not have the faith of Daniel if we're not continuously walking with God. And the key is day-to-day walking with him. Second, Daniel was still serving God at 90s. Like I said earlier, I promise you, as long as God has given you health and breath, you will not be too old to serve God. There is no way. If Gary Harthcott can do it till he's 97 years old, if Daniel can do it till he's 90, if all these others can continue to serve, we can too. And that's my heart's desire. As long as God gives me health, I want to serve him because he and he alone is worthy of it. Third thing is the world's going to be jealous of you, and they're going to try to undermine you. Why? Because they want the honor and the glory for themselves. They don't want God to get honor and glory. And then fourth, Daniel was true to God, even though he knew it would cost him. Someday it may cost us. Again, the only way we're going to be willing and ready to pay the price is if we're walking with him today and tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year, consistently walking with him, living our lives for him.